Well, hey everybody, thanks for tuning in today. You know, if someone were to ask you to describe yourself, like fill in the blank, I am, and then you fill in the blank with some things, what would you say? I mean, lots of things come to mind for me, like I am a husband, I'm a father, I'm a son, a brother, a preacher, a pastor, a minister. I'm a lover of movies. I'm at best, an average golfer. At worst, the worst golfer. I'm also a rabid University of Tennessee fan. I was born and raised in East Tennessee, and from an early age, my whole family just loved and cheered for the Tennessee Volunteers. It's why we have so much orange around CCC. Some of you will ask me from time to time, hey Dave, like what's up with all the orange in this place? Well, that's why. It's the color of the Tennessee Volunteers, and it's God's favorite color too. I actually have a picture that hangs on my office wall that my parents gave me when I moved to Maryland some years ago. It says, a Tennessean by birth, a volunteer by the grace of God. That's what I am. How would you fill in that blank for you? I am whatever. Did you know Jesus sort of went through that exercise? He fills in that blank for himself. All throughout the Gospel of John in the Bible, there are these moments where Jesus says, I am, and then he fills in the blank with these descriptors that we would be wise to become well acquainted with. That's why we're embarking on this series over the next 7 weeks, all the way through Easter, and we're going to get to know Jesus in his own words. And we're asking everyone to jump into an I am small group, dive into the daily reading guide we created, and show up for CCC services for worship and fellowship and teaching. You know, today we're starting in the 18th chapter of the Gospel of John with an incredible episode where Jesus makes maybe the greatest claim there is. Well, let's read through this episode and then we'll talk through it. John chapter 18, the first 11 verses. When he had finished praying, Jesus left with his disciples and crossed the Kidron Valley. On the other side, there was an olive grove, and he and his disciples went into it. Now, Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. So Judas came to the grove, guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and Pharisees. They were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked them, who is it you want? Jesus of Nazareth, they replied. I am he, Jesus said. And Judas the traitor was standing there with them. When Jesus said, I am he, they drew back and fell to the ground. Again, he asked them, who is it you want? Jesus of Nazareth, they said. I told you that I am he, Jesus answered. If you're looking for me, then let these men go. This happened so that the words he had spoken would be fulfilled. I've not lost one of those you gave me. Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Jesus commanded Peter, put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me? So this scene here has taken place in the last week of Jesus' life, just before he's crucified. And it's a scene that might be familiar for some of you. It's the arrest of Jesus. And there's a whole lot in here. I mean, first off, what we see in this episode is this incredible claim by Jesus himself. It's there in verse 4 and 5 when it says, Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked them, who is it that you want? Jesus of Nazareth, they replied. I am he, Jesus said. And we see that they responded in a real strange way when he said that. We'll talk about that in a minute. But here's what Jesus says. I mean, in the English translation of what is originally written in Greek there, for intelligibility purposes, the translators translate it, I am he. But literally, the word he is not there. What Jesus actually said when he stepped forward in front of these Roman soldiers was, I am. And that should ring a few bells for those of you who have some familiarity with key parts of the Bible. Like in Exodus 3, when God appears to Moses in the burning bush and says, hey, I want you to go to Pharaoh, go to the king of Egypt and tell him that I want you to let my people go. And Moses, he says, well, who should I tell Pharaoh that's sending me? Like, what's your name? And God says, tell Pharaoh, I am sent you. Just the Hebrew verb, to be, I am. That's my name. In John chapter 8, earlier in the Gospel of John here, there's this astounding spot where Jesus' opponents are talking about Abraham, and Jesus looks him straight in the eye and he says, before Abraham existed, I am. Like, he didn't say, before Abraham existed, I was, which would be amazing enough. He says, I am, just like he says it here in John 18. And what Jesus is doing is he's taking the divine name of God upon himself. And that's astonishing. And you might be saying, Dave, like, what's the big deal with this? Well, when God uses the verb to be without an object, I am, without an object, he's saying quite a lot. Like, we almost never use the verb to be without an object. We always say something like, I am this, or I am that, or we say, I am because, but God never does. See, God says, I just am. Like, there's no beginning to me. There's not an ending to me. And there's no because to me. I don't depend on my being for anyone or anything. All things, all people depend entirely, every second, on me. You see, that's a staggering claim. But when a living, breathing human being, when Jesus Christ takes that name upon himself, claims that upon himself, well, that's a whole nother level. And it's also a problem for us today. And here's why. Jesus is saying something here that no other founder of any major religion has ever said. In fact, he's saying quite the opposite of what everyone else said. Exact opposite. Don't miss this. Because every other founder of a major religion was a prophet or a teacher or something like that. And what they said was, this is the way to God. This is the way to find God. I've come to show you the way to God. Here's how you find God. But Jesus has the audacity to say, I am God. Jesus is not saying, I've come to show you how to find God. He's saying, I am the uncreated, beginningless God coming to you, looking for you, searching for you. So the founder of every other religion says, I've come to show you the way to God. And Jesus says, no, I'm God in the flesh, come to reveal myself to you. And those are completely different and utterly opposed to each other. And this is a problem for a lot of us today when it comes to religion. I mean, track with me. The modern idea in our culture is that all the different religions, including Christianity, like, they're all pretty much good. Major religions are good. They help a lot of people. They help meet some needs for people. So they're all kind of sitting there before you, and you got to decide which one is best for you in particular. But Jesus won't let that happen. And it's important to understand why. If Jesus is who he said he is, then Christianity, it would have to rise above the others because it's not founded by pointing to God. It is God coming to us saying, I'm coming to reach out to you. And therefore, if he's right, it has to be a notch above the others. But if he's wrong, like if Jesus is a liar who's just pumping sunshine to us, or he's just crazy, then it can't be. It can't be one religion among many. And we should, if that's the result, despise it and want nothing to do with it. Like, I'll hear people say often enough, they hold to the stance, well, I don't know if Jesus is the Son of God and all that, but I love the teachings of Christianity, which only goes to show that you've never read them. I mean, seriously. And I'm not trying to make fun of anybody. I'm just trying to say you probably haven't read the teachings of Jesus if you hold to that position. Because if you read the teachings of Jesus, the things that Jesus actually said, well, they're saturated with his self-understanding. I mean, check out just a couple things he said. I mean, there's one place where he says to his opponents, hey, I keep sending prophets to you. I've done this down through the centuries, and you keep killing them. That's what he says. And we're like, what? Like, here's a human being, Jesus, saying, I've been sending you folks for centuries. What are you talking about? Another time he says, I saw Satan fall from heaven like lightning. We're like, you saw what? Where were you? Who are you? What are you talking about? And this is like on every page. So it brings us back to this. Either Jesus is who he said he is, which has to make Christianity a superior faith, or he's not who he says he is, and it's an inferior faith. But Jesus will not sit on the shelf with all the rest. It can't. And it's not a matter of like, hey, Dave, you're sounding quite intolerant here. No, I'm just listening and paying attention to what the guy said. Are you? And somebody who really put this well, not too long ago, and I often think about this, he was the front man for one of the most popular rock bands in history. Think about what are considered some of the greatest rock bands down through the years, like, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Led Zeppelin, Metallica, the Grateful Dead, the Police, Foo Fighters, whoever. Well, you would have to include U2 in that company, I would think. And who's the front man for U2? It's a guy named Paul David Hewson, or better known as Bono. And Bono put this really well, what we're talking about here. He was being interviewed sort of at the height of U2's popularity when they were selling out stadiums around the world. And the interviewer says to him, hey, Jesus Christ has value and is ranked among the greatest thinkers of the world, but Son of God, don't you think that's a little far-fetched? And this is Bono who responds this way. He says, no, it's not. The secular response, he says, to the Christian story always goes like this. He was a great prophet. He had a lot of good things to say along the lines of others like Muhammad or Buddha or Confucius. But Jesus does not allow you to say that. Jesus says, no, don't call me a teacher or prophet. I'm saying I'm God incarnate. So Bono says we are left with really this. Either Christ is who he said he is, or he's a complete nutcase on the level of Charles Manson. And I'm not joking here. The idea, he says, that the entire globe, one half of the human race, has had its history completely changed by a nutcase. For me, he says, that's far-fetched. That's what Bono says. Some of you might be saying, well, hey, if Bono says it, well, the Bible must be true, But he's just being logical. And I know how uncomfortable this makes us because this kind of hurts our cultural understanding. But here's the deal. If you have a mild response to Jesus Christ, I'm not sure that has much intellectual integrity to it. If you hear what Jesus says about himself, and if you decide that he's right, then you got to fall on your knees in love and commitment to him and say, command me, and absolutely build your entire life around him. Or if you decide he's wrong, you should have nothing to do with him. You shouldn't want to read his teachings or find him inspirational at all. You should have absolute disdain for his faith. Or thirdly, it has an integrity to sort of temporarily be neutral because you're trying to figure it all out. But the thing that doesn't really hold water is to say, I kind of like Jesus. He kind of inspires me. I kind of like his teaching. I come to church ever so often. I pray a little bit. That doesn't really hold water. To tepidly respond to Jesus Christ means you're just not listening to him and you don't even know who he is. Do you see why this is important? This is the greatest claim in history, gang. Now, what happens next in John 18? It's pretty fascinating. Jesus gets out there and he says, I am. And what happens? You remember? This is verse 6 when Jesus said, I am he, and they drew back and fell to the ground. All right, so what's this all about? If we go back up to verse 2 and 3, here's what it says. So Judas came to the grove, guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and the Pharisees. They were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. Now, that word detachment is a formal word, a formal name for a group of Roman soldiers. And there could be three different meanings for this word. It could stand for a Roman cohort, which would have been made up of 600 soldiers. It could have stood for a cohort of auxiliary soldiers, which would have been about 1,000 men, including 40 soldiers on horseback. Or it could stand for a maniple, which was made up of 200 soldiers. Okay, so even if we take it to mean the smallest force there is there, 200, that's quite a group to send after a Galilean rabbi, don't you think? And either way, these would have been imperial troops. I mean, they would have been battle-hardened soldiers, tough guys, no matter how you look at it. And here is this meek, mild-mannered carpenter, this teacher, philosopher, this rabbi. And he stands up and he says, I am. 2 words, I am. And this entire Roman troop is knocked flat on their backs. Why? Well, it's because, and we see all throughout the Bible, nobody can stay on their feet in the presence of God. Everybody kind of loses their footing. And there are all these examples of this all throughout the Bible. It's like you could go back to Ezekiel 1, and in Ezekiel, God appears to Ezekiel and he's just knocked flat. Or you can go to 2 Chronicles 5, and in 2 Chronicles 5, they just dedicated the temple. When they dedicate the temple, the glory of God comes down like fire, and we're told that the priests couldn't stand to minister. Literally, they were knocked flat. They couldn't stand up. Or in Isaiah 6, the prophet Isaiah comes into the presence of God and he says, woe is me, I am just undone, I'm coming apart, and he's just knocked flat. So all throughout the Bible, we see that nobody can stand on their feet before the glory and power of God. They all lose their footing. They're all knocked down. And what we've got here in John 18 is Jesus doing the same thing. Jesus is kind of flexing a little bit, before he gives himself up, before he lays his glory aside, before he goes to the cross, before he chooses to endure the suffering and pain of the cross, he shows who he really is. And it's just a glimpse, just a glimpse of that, just a beam through the crevice, is enough to knock an entire Roman legion flat. Because in the unveiled presence of God, nobody can keep their footing. And here we are again, up against the way our culture approaches spirituality. Like when most people think of being spiritual, and most people in our culture say, hey, I'm not religious in any sort of way, I'm spiritual. Well, what people are tending to think about is this. When they think about being spiritual, they think, hey, God is a divine presence, God is a divine spirit of love, and spirituality means I'm in tune with that, and spiritual feelings mean warm, wonderful, inspiring, positive, uplifting things. It's all incredibly squishy, I would say. But that's not reality. When people actually got near even a portion of God's glory, they were terrified. It was traumatic. It wasn't warm. It wasn't wonderful. It knocked them down. Nobody can stay on their feet in the unveiled presence of God. Everybody's knocked over. And this isn't as weird or out of reach for us to understand and identify with as maybe we might think. Like when you get in the presence of some sort of human superlativeness, it can knock us off our game. When we get in the presence of someone who is big time in some sort of way, we can get a little jelly-legged, I used to play basketball at a particular place with a particular collection of guys a couple of times a week in the early morning. And one of the guys who would sometimes play with us, he was about 6'9", 6'10". He was just a mountain of a man. He was physically imposing, and he was chiseled like a statue. He's just a house. He had played college ball in West Virginia, and then he played overseas for a while, and then he was with the Harlem Globetrotters. And in their off season, he lived around here, and our run in basketball worked for his schedule. So he would get in a run with us, I think just to stay in shape. Now, he was a quiet, humble, pretty reserved fellow overall. And he read the room. He knew he was playing with some average Joes. But every now and again, he would have a burst, like he blazed down the court, just streak from one end of the court to the other with such ease and fluidity and furiosity too, such power and grace, that combination. And he'd just glide through the air and, reverse dunk the ball or something. It would happen in just a flash, just a couple of seconds. And we get this glimpse of who we were really playing with. He hardly ever dominated like that. But when he did, the rest of us would be like, oh my goodness, holy cow, what just happened? I'm taking my hot tops off because I don't need to be on the same court with this guy. It was just so cool. You may have had some moment like that in the presence of someone's superlativeness. And if that's how it is to be in the presence of human glory, if you kind of like sense yourself being taken aback, maybe getting all jelly-legged or fumbly, why do we think it would be any different with God? It would actually be far worse. That's why when Isaiah went into the temple and he saw the Lord high and lifted up and he saw the cherubim singing, holy, 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 and there was smoke in there and he could hardly see in there, but he got near the glory of God and he said, oh, woe is me. I am undone. I'm coming apart. See, he was falling apart, Isaiah was. And so was everybody in that olive grove in John 18. Nobody can stand in the presence of God. And that's what we're seeing here in this episode in Jesus. We have completely lost this idea in our culture. We just think of God as some sort of warm fuzzy. We have reduced him to someone small. So many people think of Jesus as a nice guy with nice sayings who did some nice things at one point in time. Does your picture of Jesus need to expand? Fortunately for us, the majesty of Jesus, the vastness of Jesus, the power and glory of Jesus, it doesn't keep us from being able to know him and trust him. He is still so approachable. And that's on display here too in John 18. When they say they're looking for Jesus of Nazareth and Jesus says, I am, and they're all knocked flat there. And we don't know how long they're like that. Maybe they're scared to death because of his flexing a bit there. But then Jesus sort of restarts the conversation. Maybe he clears his throat to settle him down and he says, who did you say you were looking for again? One guy says, Jesus of Nazareth, maybe sheepishly. And in verse 8, Jesus says, I told you that I'm he. If you're looking for me, then let these men go. The Bible tells us this happened so that the words he had spoken would be fulfilled. I've not lost one of those that you gave me. Now, gang, this right here is why we can trust him. Keep in mind that when the soldiers arrived, all the disciples were in mortal danger because, again, the soldiers probably numbered 200 people at least. And protocol was if you are arresting someone, you also arrest his followers. There's about a dozen of them with Jesus, and they were almost certainly going to be taken in prison, which means nobody would have heard of them again. But Jesus deliberately says, hey, it's me you want. Are you seeking me? He says, are you demanding me? That's what it literally means. Then he says, let them go. And ironically, or maybe not ironically, the words let them go means forgive them. Forgive them and take me. Me for them. Substitution, gang. Let them go and take me. And this is the heart of our faith. What's going on here is the great exchange. This incredible cosmic swap is happening right here in the garden. Jesus, in all his power and glory, gives himself up for us in all our weakness and sin. And this is the gospel. This is the heart of our faith. And this is the heart of God toward you. Do you see? The great I am is saving his followers. That's what he's doing here in John 18 for them. And that's what he's done for you too. This is why the concept of Jesus being the I am is so crucial. If he is God, he has the right, he has the position, he has the authority to be our substitute. He is qualified to be our substitution in a way that no one else could be. He went to the cross and he took on our sin. And what gives him the right to do that is because he's the I am. You and I have to have this, or we're not going to stand one day on that great day of judgment. It's me you want, he says. I'll take their place. Forgive them. Do you believe this? Imagine believing this to the bottom of your heart. If you believe that Jesus Christ is God in the flesh, the Son of God, the great I am, the one who came to earth and instead of smiting us, though he obviously could have, I mean, just look what he did to these Roman soldiers with just a glance. But he went to the cross and took our sin so that we would not be undone. Then our response should be to fall before him with our entire lives, to build our lives around him. Or, if you're not sure if you believe this, I want to encourage you to keep coming back. I mean, this series could be just the investment you ought to make. This scene, it's so crazy. This man speaks 2 words. Jesus speaks 2 words, and an entire attachment of soldiers falls flat. And then he says, but hey, I'm going to hand myself over. You can take me. I'm going to give myself up for them. It's remarkable. And I love how it ends. It's so comforting to me. Did you notice that with Peter, at the end of the episode, what happens? I want you to know how comforted I am by what Peter does. I mean, keep in mind, Peter has been with Jesus for 3 years. I mean, he's been in this 3-year graduate training with Jesus. And Jesus has been telling him about this very moment, about the cross, about what he's going to do. If you go back through the Gospels, John, Matthew, Mark, Luke, Jesus has been saying all along the way, hey, I didn't come to rule, I came to die. I didn't come to pick up the sword, I came to give my life. I'm going to be betrayed, Peter. I'm going to be given into the hands of the chief priests. He's been telling Peter about this for 3 years, been getting him ready with the gospel, teaching him the gospel, telling him the gospel leading up to this moment. And then the key moment arrives, and what does Peter do? He gets out his sword and he attacks. And I can't tell you how encouraged I am that Jesus did not turn to the soldiers at this point and say, you know what? I've changed my mind. Why don't you just take Peter along instead of me? I mean, seriously, why didn't Jesus turn and say, I'm supposed to die for this guy? I'm supposed to die for a person who denies me and everything I'm about in word and deed to the very moment of my death? But Jesus doesn't. What he says is, all right, Peter, let's go over the gospel one more time. This is the cup that the Father's given me to drink. You see, this is unyielding love. No amount of pain will stop Jesus Christ from saving us. And no amount of our own stupidity will stop him from reaching out to us. And no amount of us not living up to the gospel in our daily life will stop him from loving us. And just so we'll never get too far away from this, Jesus, in his infinite wisdom, he attached a reminder to a meal and instructed us to make celebrating this meal a practice when we get together. It's called communion. And we're going to celebrate it right now. Wherever you're watching or listening to this, just take a piece of bread and take some juice and remember that Jesus set aside his glory. He emptied himself of what was rightfully his. He humbled himself and became obedient to death on a cross so we could be forgiven and we could be free and full of life and hope.